picky, but
You got to bang something.
yeah.
That came out wrong. But
Okay. Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Welcome, Secretary Liu. We appreciate you being here with us this morning, and your full written testimony will be made part of the record. Given that the House of Representatives is scheduled to begin voting at approximately 10 a.m. this morning, I'd ask that you'd provide a brief oral summary of your testimony so we can move more quickly to questions from members of the committee. But in order to give as many members as possible the opportunity to question the Secretary, Ranking Member Levin and I will forego our opening statements. And in addition, we will reduce to 3 minutes the time for questioning. So, Secretary Liu, welcome, and please begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Levin, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the President's budget. Before I begin, let me say a few words about the situation in Ukraine. President Obama has explained in no uncertain terms that the steps Russia has taken to violate Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine's territorial integrity, and are a breach of international law. As the President announced this morning, he has signed an executive order to authorize sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for activities that undermine the democratic process, threaten the peace, security, stability, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of Ukraine, or misappropriate state assets within Ukraine. This executive order is a flexible tool that will allow us to sanction those who are most directly involved in destabilizing Ukraine, including the military intervention in Crimea, and does not preclude further steps should the situation deteriorate. These sanctions build upon previous actions that the United States has taken, but at the same time, as the President has said, we're prepared to work with all parties to de-escalate the situation, and we call on Russia to take the necessary actions to resolve this crisis. It's in Russia, the United States, and the world's best interest to have a stable and prosperous Ukraine. And as the Ukrainian government prepares for elections in May, it's critical that the international community work together to support its efforts to restore economic stability. I've spoken with the Ukrainian Prime Minister a number of times, and he's told me that the government is ready to adopt vital economic reforms. We've been working closely with international partners and Congress to develop an assistance package that will help the Ukrainian government implement reforms needed to restore financial stability and return to economic growth. As part of this international effort, the United States has developed a package of bilateral assistance focused on meeting Ukraine's most pressing needs. This package will include $1 billion in loan guarantees and IMF quota legislation, which would support the IMF's capacity to lend additional resources to Ukraine and help preserve continued U.S. leadership within this important institution at a critical time. While the United States will not increase our total financial commitment to the IMF by approving the 2010 reforms, it's important to note that for every dollar the United States contributes to the IMF, other countries provide $4 more. At a time when the U.S. is at the forefront of international calls and urging the fund to play a central and active first responder role in Ukraine, it's imperative that we secure passage of IMF legislation now so we can show support for the IMF in this critical moment and preserve our leading influential voice in that institution. I want to be clear that even as we deal with the unfolding events in Ukraine, we continue to focus on our central objective, which is expanding opportunity for all Americans. Over the past 5 years, we've accomplished a number of important things to make our country stronger and better positioned for the future. In fact, since 2009, the economy has steadily expanded. Our businesses have added 8.5 million jobs over the last 47 months. The housing market has improved, and rising housing prices are pulling millions of homeowners from underwater. At the same time, household and business balance sheets continue to heal, exports are growing, and manufacturing is making solid gains. The truth is, as the President said in his State of the Union, we are more ready to meet the demands of the 21st century than any other country on earth. Nevertheless, our economy was thrown against the ropes by the worst recession of our lifetimes. And while we're back on our feet, we're not where we want to be yet. Everyone here understands that, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? The President's budget lays out a clear path to move us in the right direction. It not only fulfills the President's pledge to make this a year of action, it offers a framework for long-term prosperity and competitiveness. This budget addresses the critical issues we face as a nation. It recognizes that while corporate profits have been hitting all-time highs, middle-class wages hit a plateau, with long-term unemployment an ongoing challenge. It recognizes that while the stock market has been vibrant, saving for retirement and paying for college is a little more than a dream for millions of American families. It recognizes that while our national security threats are shifting and we're bringing the war in Afghanistan to a responsible end, soldiers, military families, and veterans struggle to succeed in our economy. And it recognizes that while work is being done to put the final pieces of financial reform in place, reforms like the Volcker Rule have made our financial system stronger and an engine for economic growth once again. The solutions in this budget flow from a frank assessment of these challenges. They're carefully designed to show the choices we can make to increase opportunity and bolster the middle class. For instance, a cornerstone of these proposals is to expand the Earned Income Tax Credit so it reaches more childless workers. We know this credit is one of the most effective tools for fighting poverty, and it's time to adjust it so it does an even better job rewarding hard work. This tax cut, which would go to more than 13 million Americans, will be fully offset by ending loopholes that let high-income professionals avoid the income and payroll taxes that other workers pay. Another initiative that will make a difference for hardworking men and women is MyRA. This retirement security program will be available later this year, and it will allow Americans to start building a nest egg that's simple, safe, and can never go down in value. While this budget puts forward essential pro-growth initiatives, it also calls on Congress to reinforce our growth-enhancing strategies by passing measures like comprehensive immigration reform and trade promotion authority. But even as it does these things, make no mistake, this budget is also serious about building on the success we've made together to restore fiscal responsibility. The fact of the matter is the deficit as a share of GDP has fallen by more than half since the President took office, marking the most rapid decline in the deficit since the period of demobilization following the end of World War II. The deficit is projected to narrow even more this year, and today we're charting a course that will push the deficit down to below 2% of GDP by 2024 and rein in the national debt relative to the size of the economy over 10 years. Last year, the President put forward his last offer to Speaker Boehner in his budget as part of a balanced compromise. This year's budget reflects the President's vision of the best path forward. While the President stands by his last offer, he believes that the measures in his budget are the best way to strengthen the economy now. As this budget demonstrates, the President is firmly committed to making tough choices to tackle our fiscal challenges, and our fair and balanced solutions represent a comprehensive approach to strengthening our nation's financial footing. This approach shrinks the deficit and debt by making detailed, responsible changes to Medicare while eliminating wasteful corporate tax loopholes and subsidies that do not help our economy and by scrapping tax breaks for those who do not need them. Increasing basic fairness in our tax code is not just about improving our nation's fiscal health, though. It's also about generating room so we can make investments that will strengthen the foundation of our economy for years to come. This means helping to create more jobs by repairing our infrastructure, increasing manufacturing, boosting research and technology, and fostering domestic energy production. It means training Americans so they can get those jobs by promoting apprenticeships and upgrading worker training programs. It means improving our education system by expanding access to preschool and modernizing high schools. And it means making sure hard work pays off by creating more promise zones, increasing college affordability, and raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour and indexing it to inflation. In closing, let me point out that this budget represents a powerful jobs, growth, and opportunity plan. It is carefully designed to make our economy stronger while keeping our fiscal house in order. What's more, it offers Washington a real chance to work together. As everyone on this committee knows, for far too long, brinksmanship in Washington has been a drag on economic growth. But we've seen a significant amount of bipartisan progress in recent months that's helped improve economic momentum. Some cynics say it's fleeting, some call it election year posturing, but I don't agree. I believe this progress is real. I believe we can keep finding common ground to make a difference, and I believe we can continue to get serious things done on behalf of the American people by working together. I thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. The administration's budget proposal assumes that 3 temporary tax provisions that were first enacted in 2009 and expire in 2017 are permanent. This means that making them permanent doesn't, quote-unquote, cost anything, as they don't have to be offset. Making these provisions permanent relative to current law is estimated to cost about $154 billion. What standard did you use to determine what extenders would be assumed to be permanent and not offset, and which would not?
Mr. Chairman, you're asking a question about the baseline that we used, and baselines are a complicated technical matter. We've tried for a number.
I'm fully aware of that.
I know. I understand you know that, and we've tried for the last number of years to have the baseline reflect as best as it can the things that are, in practice, more permanent and really part of the ongoing challenge of funding government. We believe the refundable tax credits, the earned income tax credit, the items you're referring to should be made permanent. We made that case, obviously, many times over. It actually doesn't make a difference whether it's in the baseline or not in terms of what the final bottom line is. A budget has to cover all of the spending and revenue flows in it. And the bottom line is that when you look at our budget, by reducing the deficit to 3% of GDP and on a path to 1.9% of GDP, we've put together a package that accommodates it. It's a technical decision that I think is the right one. Others, the Center for Responsible Budgets, the Senate Budget Committee, others have made a similar decision. I understand there are technical issues in baseline that
well, and
if
I might, there are many tax extenders that have been part of the tax code for a lot longer than those three provisions, such as Section 179 for small business expensing, which was part of the 2001 and 2003 tax relief, or the R&D tax credit, for example, which was enacted in 1981. So I think a strong case can be made that these provisions should be permanent as well. And obviously, when I released the discussion draft on comprehensive reform, I specifically asked for feedback on that particular issue, and I would just ask you your thoughts on a discussion about which tax extenders should be part of the baseline, and do you think that's an appropriate discussion to have?
Mr. Chairman, I actually think that when we do tax reform, coming out of tax reform, we would be better off if we had more of a sense of permanence, because certainty about what is in the tax code and what isn't helps to contribute to more certainty is a better environment for investment. The challenge we've had is with the extenders is there's been an ongoing debate about which ones to extend and whether or not they're permanent. And we believe that the tax credits that we put in the baseline are items that have a different character. We did propose as a matter of policy to make the research and experimentation tax credit permanent. So we totally agree that there are items that should be made permanent. And what's policy and what's baseline is something we're happy to talk about. Coming out of tax reform, and I will note that in the plan you put forward, there's some very clear paths there, which some of it overlaps considerably with what we're talking about.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to having that discussion with you on those issues. On another topic, a lot of people are angry about how complicated the tax code is, and I certainly hear that from people in my district who are hardworking taxpayers. As we've talked about in this committee, the code has 15 different provisions for saving for college. The IRS has a 90-page instruction booklet on that. The draft reform legislation includes the bipartisan proposal by Congressman Davis and Black to consolidate and modernize certain tax breaks. Now, my question to you is, are there certain opportunities to reform and simplify the code, particularly for parents trying to save for college education or hardworking taxpayers, that we can accomplish without necessarily having to resolve the question about whether comprehensive reform should raise revenue or not?
Mr. Chairman, there I think is always room for conversations about what we can do to make the tax code more efficient, more effective, and easier for people to use. I do think that as we get to the conversation of comprehensive tax reform, it's inherently tied to the fundamental question of whether revenue is part of a long-term fiscal plan. On the question of the education provisions, simplification is a desirable goal, but we also have different objectives that are achieved by different pieces of the code now. And I think the challenge and a conversation we look forward to having with you is how to get the balance right so that we still are encouraging the kind of behavior that we think makes a difference for the economic future of both families and the country. And I know in your plan, there are changes, some of which we have questions about in terms of like the AOTC, and I think those are important questions for us to work through.
Yeah, and I was obviously asking about not necessarily a comprehensive approach, but on individuals. But lastly, the administration says that the business tax reform is long-run revenue neutral. And that strikes me as being inaccurate, given that the way I read your budget, you're really proposing a $150 billion business tax increase in the first decade to pay for infrastructure, and then the proposal would be revenue neutral in years 11 and beyond. I think, put another way, I think it could be described, if you looked at year one to the long run, it's really a $150 billion tax increase, because I think truly to be revenue neutral, you need to calculate the $150 billion as part of that approach. Don't the first 10 years count as well?
Mr. Chairman, the challenge is that any tax reform is going to throw off a certain amount of revenue at the beginning, as there's a transition that won't be there in the long run. So if one were to take that revenue and lower rates permanently, it almost forces you to lose revenue after the introductory period. So years 11 through 20 would start to lose revenue. There's a choice what to do with the one-time flows. You could reduce the deficit with it, and that's a perfectly legitimate decision to make, or you could do one-time expenditures. We believe that a one-time expenditure on building infrastructure would be good for the economic future of this country, and that's why we proposed it. I actually think that when I talk to CEOs, one of the things that they raise with me, even before tax issues, is the need for infrastructure. So I actually think that there's support in the business community for the idea.
Yeah, outside of the motivation for it, but it is a $150 billion cost in the first decade. But I think, am I inaccurate in that it's revenue neutral in years 11 and beyond? So if you look at the entire time frame in question, it is actually not revenue neutral to the tune of $150 billion.
There is a dilemma, Mr. Chairman, that if you crank the savings, the revenues that come for one time when there are timing shifts or when new provisions go into effect into permanent rate changes, you will lose money in the out years. So you would have to step down rates as you got to year 11 to be truly revenue neutral. We think our proposal is a better approach than that.
All right. Mr. Levin.
Welcome.
Good to be here.
I welcome your statement and the President's actions on Ukraine. And I hope all of us will rally together to be supportive of the President's action. And I think the Chairman has started this off on the right step, if I might say so that we talk about your testimony and issues relating to that, including tax reform. I think that's the way we should be doing at this hearing and not wander off into other subjects. So let me ask you about two portions of your comprehensive testimony. On page 4, you say, because long-term unemployment remains a pressing economic and social issue, the budget provides resources for new public-private partnerships to help get the long-term unemployed back into paying jobs. I think that's right on target. Just if you would state briefly the position of the administration on extension of unemployment compensation to the long-term unemployed, now over 2 million who have lost their benefits.
Congressman Levin, we strongly support the extension of long-term unemployment benefits. As we look at the unemployment statistics, it's clear that short-term unemployment is coming back down to a more normal range, but long-term unemployment is staying stubbornly high. And that means that there are people who are looking for work who can't find work, and we need to continue, as we have every time unemployment has been at these kinds of levels, respond with long-term unemployment benefits that phase out as the unemployment rate comes down. I think the important thing for us to do is deal with the short-term need by extending long-term unemployment benefits, but also focus on what we do to get the economy growing faster, creating more jobs, which is why we focus on things like rebuilding our infrastructure, on skills training, and manufacturing hubs, the things that will be job creators to create opportunities for people.
Good. My time will be up soon. I just wanted to refer on page 2 to your statement about non-defense discretionary funding levels. And I hope during our discussion you'll have a chance to analyze this, because I think the way we're headed, non-defense discretionary funding levels are now being lowered to levels that we haven't seen in decades.
Congressman, that's definitely true. We've done an enormous amount of deficit reduction, most of it through spending reduction, most of it through discretionary spending reduction. I think that what we are trying to do in this budget is make a case that on both the defense and the non-defense side, in order to meet the needs of our nation, we're going to have to find ways to hit our fiscal targets while restoring the ability to invest in our future and defend the country.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Brady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday's decision by the White House to allow canceled insurance plans under the ACA to continue past the election, was that primarily a political decision?
Congressman, as you know, that decision was a decision that was in the purview of the Department of HHS, not Treasury. I think I can speak generally to it, but not specifically. In general, our approach to the implementation has been to do everything we can to implement the Affordable Care Act in a smooth, effective way. Obviously, there were some bumps at the beginning. We've fixed the technical issues, and we're moving forward.
But this is not a technical issue. I mean, until recently, both you and the President described these plans as substandard. Are these plans still viewed as substandard?
Congressman, again, I'm going to leave the discussion of it. You'll have
well, it's in
Secretary
your
Sebelius
budget.
Here.
That's what we're here to talk about.
And the goal in implementing the Affordable Care Act has been to make sure that the new plans can be in place.
I guess my question is,
exchanges can be in place, and we're working
what
very hard
has
at
changed? If these were substandard plans as described by the President, and I believe you said Americans deserve better, are they still viewed as substandard plans?
You know, Congressman, I think we've been clear that we think that the right level of coverage is prescribed in the Affordable Care Act, and we have exchanges in place, both state and federal, to offer that coverage, and we're going to work very hard to get people into those plans.
But obviously, with the White House continuing to delay or change these, clearly something is wrong, or they would have left it in place. So my question is this primarily a political decision? Because the substandard plans, as described by you and the White House a couple of weeks ago, haven't changed. So what's changed?
We have been working since the enactment of the Affordable Care Act to step-by-step implement it as effectively as possible. I think the announcements yesterday are the last major changes that affect individuals and businesses, and it provides a clear path for the time forward, and that clarity is important.
Obviously, for something to change, the view has to be that forcing people in the Affordable Care Act is more harmful to them than allowing them to stay on substandard plans, correct?
No, I
mean, it has to be one or the other. As great as it is, or there's a problem with making them change plans.
I think through the Affordable Care Act, we are offering people choices. Those choices are good choices. People are signing up at very
if they're good,
rapid
I don't mean
rates.
to interrupt, but if they're good choices, why the change, if not for politics?
I'm going to just repeat what I said, which is that we're looking at the implementation of the Affordable Care Act to have it be as smooth as possible.
Are there any other delays being considered?
I think that we've now put in place the major pieces for individuals and for businesses, and our goal is to sign
No
people
other
up.
changes? Can you commit to us, and people who are wondering, will there be any more delays of the ACA?
Yeah. We're going to continue to implement the Affordable Care Act in as effective a way as we can, and I'm not aware of any other changes, but obviously I can't tell you what we'll discover going forward.
All right, thank you. Mr. Rangel.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman for bringing up the important question of tax reform, and we haven't enjoyed too much of a bipartisan atmosphere here. Mr. Secretary, do you have any reason to believe that the administration would be able to have some form of tax reform with the Republican majority in the House, other than the bill, the draft rather, being presented?
Congressman Rangel, I actually believe that there is space for us to work together. I think we've made it clear that on the business side, we think that there's a convergence of thinking. If you look at the draft bill that the chairman put out and the white paper that the president put out, there are a lot of areas, not of identical provisions, but overlap. I think we could work together on large pieces. As I said in my response to the chairman, I think there is a fundamental question on individual reform that we disagree on whether it should be revenue neutral or whether it should contribute to the long-term fiscal plan.
Let me reframe my
And I think
question.
that's a bigger obstacle.
There's absolutely no question that there is a vast areas that we could be working together. My question to you, have you received any indication other than the submission of a draft bill that the Congress is going to work with the administration toward any type of tax reform?
Well, I have conversations with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee on a regular basis.
And have you reached a conclusion that with this conversation it's possible that we could do something?
I'm a big believer in possibility. I think if people keep talking, anything is possible.
Well, we have a lot of problems with unemployment, and the results of this has been a vast boom in homelessness. And I'm glad to see that there is a expansion and targeted of giving support to the homeless as well as affordable housing. Is there any way for you to give to us the congressional districts that are suffering with unemployment as well as affordable housing? Have you got that broken down, the statistical data? I just can't believe that only Democrats are suffering.
Yeah. Congressman, we obviously don't do the unemployment data at the Treasury Department. The Department of Labor does. I'm happy to have somebody go back and ask if it's available on a congressional district.
I would really appreciate to see how many Americans are suffering because the Congress is not moving forward with supportive legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Teaberry.
Mr. Liu, thank you for being here. I raised an issue last year when you were before us regarding a situation that impacted many of my Ohio constituents, and I've yet to receive a reply, and so I was hoping to broach it with you again, and don't expect you to answer it today, but if you could make sure your staff replies. This week marks 2 years since the IRS issued a memorandum taxing aircraft management services as commercial aviation subject to the ticket tax instead of general aviation subject to the fuel tax. This is contrary to congressional intent with a law that was passed in 1970 and contrary to IRS practices for 40 years. This just changed 2 years ago, and we still haven't been able to get a reason as to why they've done this. So about a month ago, a little over a month ago, I sent you a bipartisan letter on the issue, and I haven't heard back. Again, don't expect you to answer it today, but if you could flag it and have
flag it, Congressman.
Staff get back to us, because there is bipartisan concern about what's happening. Other issue I just want you to touch on briefly, if you could, is you've been around this town a long time, and you understand, like all of us understand, that the structural driver of our debt is mandatory spending. So no matter what happens and no matter what we do on the discretionary side, we continue to have an increase in mandatory spending. And we see that as far as the eye can see. And so for my kids, we're doing them a disservice by not tackling what really is the true driver of our national debt. Now you, in the President's budget, arguably take a step backwards. You still do some provider cuts. But when are we, you and me, I'm not making this a partisan issue, Democrats and Republicans with leadership from the White House, going to start tackling, through reforms, substantive reforms, the structural driver of our debt?
Congressman, I think we should start by recognizing that we've actually done a lot. And I know we don't all agree on the Affordable Care Act, but I think we can agree that if we look at what has happened to health care costs in this country, the rate of growth is coming down. And I believe that the action taken in the Affordable Care Act is part of that. If health care costs come down, that has an enormous impact on what the direction and the slope of the growth of entitlement costs is. So we've done quite a lot. In our budget, we have, as you noted, some more provider savings, but we also have some things that are tough policy, like income-related premiums, where in bipartisan conversations, it's been one of the reforms that we've looked at. The President made clear when he put his proposal on change CPI in the budget that he was doing it because that's something that we understood was necessary to have a bipartisan discussion on an overall package. It was never his first choice. Since we're not in the middle of a bipartisan discussion, I wouldn't describe it as a step back. He's put his vision of where we're going forward. He's also said if there's an interest in the last offer, it's on the table. I think that we have to look at what we've accomplished. We've reduced the deficit by half. We're on a path where we're at 3% of GDP going down to less than 2% of GDP. I don't disagree that we have challenges on the revenue and the entitlement side, tax reform and entitlement reform, that we're going to need to deal with. I don't think we have the kind of emergency that we had, a few years ago when we were looking at deficits as a percentage of GDP that were an immediate problem. We have a challenge now where what we have to do is get a bipartisan spirit together so everything can be on the table. On the table, I think we can do it.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jack, I'm pleased that you're here talking about the budget, and we only have a minute or two, so I want to focus on one issue, and that's the whole issue of the minimum wage. It strikes me that year after year, the basket of goods that people can buy has dropped over the course of time with the minimum wage. And I put this graph up there so that people could see where the minimum wage has been. Now, in 1938, when Charlie and I were born or so, it was 25 cents an hour and has gradually risen to $7.25. And the value of its ability to buy, what its value in buying, has dropped. And you can see the red dots. You can't buy as much as you could with the minimum wage in the past. And the president, in the state of Washington, we are at 919. We're leading the country. Oregon's right behind us at 885, I think. Talk about what the increase in the minimum wage means to the economy.
Congressman, I think that you got to start with what the minimum wage means to a working family. Anyone who's working full-time in this country should have a wage that's at least at the poverty level. And that's what a minimum wage of $10.10 would do. I think we all know that somebody who's taking home wages at that level is spending the money as they earn it. So it's going straight into consumption, straight into demand, and that goes into the economy. We also know that we have a disparity of income in this country, and that for people at the high end, they shouldn't be spending all of their earnings. But it's not an environment where the money's finding its way all back into the economy. A lot of money sitting on the sidelines. I think that raising the minimum wage right now would actually be good for the economy. There are economists who've made arguments in both directions. You can have competing studies. I think that it's the right thing to do, and it's good for the economy. And our experience when we've seen the increases in the minimum wages in states, or when the federal government raised the minimum wage in the 90s, was that it was basically neutral in terms of the economy. I think right now, given where we are, it would actually be helpful.
Is there any study, any place that shows that raising the minimum wage depressed the economy?
Look, there are all kinds of studies out there, so I don't want to say there are no studies showing. The studies that I find persuasive support the argument that I made.
Okay, I guess we all do that. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Reich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Lew, in 2009, the administration economists predicted that under the administration's $1 trillion stimulus plan, the unemployment rate would never rise above 8%, but we all know that's not what happened. Unemployment rate soared above 8% for 3 years. It's fallen to 6.6% only because I think millions of people have stopped looking for work and are no longer counted as officially unemployed. So that's nowhere near the 5% unemployment rate the administration said we would have by now. In fact, your current budget, the administration doesn't expect the unemployment rate to return to 5% ever. The best we'll ever see is 5.4. Why has this been the weakest recovery for jobs ever?
Congressman, when we came in January 2009, we knew the economy was bad, but when the statistics were finalized as to how bad it was, the deep hole from that recession was much worse than anyone knew at the time. So I think you have to look at it in perspective of how bad the situation was. It was much worse than when those projections were made. It was much worse than anyone understood. I think if you look at the path of the recovery, given how bad it was when we started, bringing the unemployment rate into the mid-sixes is a lot of progress. We have said it's not enough.
Secretary, we're now going on 6 years, and why should we believe the administration's policies in this budget will work any better to promote job creation and reduce unemployment?
I actually think that if you look at the record of this administration between the Recovery Act and the Dodd-Frank Act and the actions we took, we contributed in a very significant way to the recovery. And if you compare the United States to other developed economies, we have a stronger economy that's growing better because we took decisive action.
Sir, the budget that you're presenting today, how can we have faith that it will speed up our economic recovery?
I think the policies stand on their own. I'm happy when we have the time to make the case on individual
I think the unemployment
policies.
rate
But
speaks for itself.
I think the record of where we are compared to other developed economies is a very compelling case.
And I know my time is limited. Real quickly, can you assure us that by next week you can have to this committee at the request of Dave Camp, as the chairman has repeated over and over, the emails and documents from Lois Lerner?
You know, I know that we've been back and forth on that issue, and there are conversations with the IRS on that. I'm going to leave that to the conversations that we've had.
Can you commit to providing those documents by the end of the week, next week?
We have worked to respond to the
commitment.
committee's requests, and we will continue to be
It's not happening, sir. Can you commit to make it happen? Without a deadline, can you make it happen?
Congressman,
yes or no?
We will continue to work with,
Can't do it.
with this committee.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Many of us, Mr. Secretary, feel that it's our duty to ensure that the IRS has the tools it needs for taxpayer service and enforcement. During the past few years, the budget of the IRS are being reduced. I noticed in the President's budget it's getting a small increase. I believe the budget is been cut by $1 billion. The President's budget proposed $12.5 billion in funding for the IRS. It's small. It's necessary to increase the IRS budget. How can the IRS provide the service to the people we represent if the budget is steadily being cut and not increased? Reduce service, reduce employees?
Congressman, I agree 100% that the IRS needs to have resources to do its work for two reasons. First of all, it is just a bad business decision to not fund the IRS so that it can collect taxes effectively, and our system of voluntary compliance depends on an effective IRS. You know, secondly, when individuals, citizens call the IRS for help, they ought to be able to get somebody on the other end of the phone. And if you don't have people there, they can't get their phone calls answered. So I think funding the IRS is of critical importance, and we put in our budget actually a substantial increase to demonstrate how important we think it is, about a 7.5% increase. And I know it's a difficult time given budget constraints, but I think the dollars put into the IRS pay off in many ways, not the least of which is we collect revenue that's due.
It's a worthy and good investment.
It's a good investment, and you know, look, I know that it's not a good thing when people call and ask for advice or an interpretation and explanation and nobody answers the phone. We owe people to be there to answer the phone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Bustani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Lew. It's widely acknowledged, and we agree, that a key economic policy is moving forward on trade, international trade with TPP and TTIP, and yet we have Trade Promotion Authority legislation, specific legislation, bipartisan, bicameral, that's been introduced. Can you, it's widely acknowledged, too, that the administration, cabinet have not put in the political capital going forward to get this passed. And with the exception of perhaps Ambassador Froman, who has been vigorously, pursuing this, can you commit on the part of the administration that this legislation, this specific legislation, H.R. 3830, the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities Act, is a priority for this administration and to to see passage of this?
Congressman, the President addressed this issue in his State of the Union
One
very
sentence,
clearly.
and it really was a bland statement. And our trading partners are looking for a definitive statement because they're not going to negotiate to finality on these agreements until we have trade promotion authority.
I spend a considerable amount of my time talking to our trading partners. The finance ministers have a piece of these trade negotiations in the financial area, and I've spoken to most of my counterparts in TPP countries trying to advance our interests in trade negotiations because the test here is bringing back a TPP and a TTIP that meet our standard of a high-quality agreement.
Absolutely.
And I've worked with the chairman on issues related to the TPA. We do have a new chairman in the Senate Finance Committee. He's expressed an interest in going and having some additional consultation on this. There is no question but that we support we are putting a huge effort into
So all the work
TPP and
done in
TTIP.
getting a bipartisan, bicameral agreement on this legislation is going to be for naught if we're basically starting over on it.
Well, I'm not going to speak for anyone else in terms of whether it's starting over or working from where you are. That's really, Chairman is going to have to make his own judgment.
So the administration is not committed to this specific piece of legislation?
I think we've made clear that we support TPA. We support TPA that addresses the critical issues, and we are available to work with Congress on this, and we want to get it done as quickly as possible. I don't think we should take our eye off of the trade negotiations themselves, because I don't agree with your characterization in terms of the progress made. I just this week had some conversations with some of our principal counterparts where I've gotten concessions on important issues that advance the process. So
well, I have no doubt
we're working very
that's
hard on
the
it.
case, but to really get to the point of seeing these countries, our negotiating partners, making tough domestic political decisions to complete this, Congress is going to have to pass TPA, and we have specific legislation. Yeah. It's ready to go. I don't understand why the administration is not putting a full court press into this to get this legislation.
What I've said to our trading partners in my conversations is we are committed to getting these agreements finalized. We're committed to getting TPA, and we're committed to getting across the finish line on these things. Now let's get to work. And they get back to work. So I don't think we should feed the idea that you can't make progress on TPP or TTIP.
All right, thank you. The committee stands in recess until 11 o'clock. The committee will be in order. First of all, I want to publicly thank the Secretary for accommodating the schedule today. It's been rather disruptive, and very much appreciate your making yourself available.
My pleasure.
Mr. Neal is recognized.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, just a word of applause to your efforts on EITC, Auto IRA, and continued support for new markets tax credits. And then I want to use my time to give it to you for the purpose of talking about a much underreported budget outlook from where we were 5 years ago. So perhaps you could lay out for the committee where we were and where we are.
Well, Congressman, you know, I don't. It's hard to exaggerate how much improvement we've seen from 5 years ago till now. I mean, we obviously saw an economy that was in free fall and deficits that were growing, and the need to respond to that economic crisis, and deficits that were, at historically high levels. We've cut the deficits in half. We've gotten the debt and the deficit as a percentage of GDP under control. And clearly we have challenges for the long term. I think we all know that there are challenges that we're going to have to deal with over the next number of years. But we've actually reached a point where, unlike the last number of years, we don't have an urgent, immediate fiscal crisis. We have actually a very sustainable path for the period of time covered by this budget, which actually gives us an important opportunity to shift our attention to what does it take to build a strong, growing economy? What are the foundations of a growing economy? Which is why in this budget we focus so much on things like infrastructure and skills training and manufacturing hubs. And it doesn't mean that we don't have to do it in the context of a responsible fiscal policy. Obviously, we have in our budget the way we think you make the trade-offs to stay on the right fiscal path. It's a world of difference than it was 5 years ago. And I think if you look at what I was a little earlier talking about in terms of the comparison of the United States to other developed economies, we're in a world of better shape. We have a lot more to do before we're going to be satisfied. But when I meet with my international colleagues and I talk to them about struggling to get over 3% of GDP growth, they think getting to 1% would be more than they can imagine. And so we're doing much better.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. I also will note that the Secretary has a hard stop at 12 noon. Mr. Roscom is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to draw your attention to the interchange between your department and Chairman Camp on the question of C4s, subject of a lot of debate and discussion recently. The Chairman sent a letter to you, and then your Assistant Secretary responded on February 25th. And in the response, the Assistant Secretary made four very, in my view, broad conclusions, and this is in paragraph 3 of the February 25th letter, and I want to walk them through you, point out that the claims, I think, are not meritorious. So the letter claims that the proposed rule doesn't restrict any form of speech. And in terms of the proposed rule, we're talking about the administration's proposed rule on C4s. And yet, both the American Civil Liberties Union and the Heritage Foundation have come to a very different conclusion on that. I mean, and the ACLU really comes out with an admonition. They say that it will, your rule, your proposed rule, will pose insurmountable compliance issues that go beyond practicality and raise First Amendment concerns of the highest order. So ironically, the administration has been able to bring together the ACLU and the Heritage Foundation in criticism, but why would the department be just so completely dismissive of that First Amendment claim and just make an assertion basically in paragraph 3 of the letter? Do you stand by that assertion, or do you understand the level of concern that people have about the chilling effect on First Amendment?
Congressman, I understand that this issue raises very strong feelings on both sides. I think it actually...
It's not the feelings I'm concerned about. It's the merits of the argument. Do you think it encroaches on First Amendment?
Look, I think that the challenge of defining what is and is not covered by this is it is a big challenge. And the reason we put out draft rules the way we did was to invite the kind of comment that we're getting. I think that we were very clear that this is an area where we need the benefit of a lot of views being expressed. I'm not sure we envisioned 150,000 views being expressed, but we've gotten more comment on this than on any other rule that we've ever issued And we're now looking at it, and we're going to take everything under advisement. We're going to look at the issue. The IRS will continue to work on it. And we're very open to hearing what the pros and cons of different approaches here is. And this is something that if it was easy to deal with, probably would have been dealt with a long time ago. And I think we're at the beginning, not the end of the process of working our way through.
You can sense a bit of reluctance in my voice in that it seems that the department has made a decision already about the nature of the proposed rule when the Assistant Secretary is making an assertion, and the assertion is it does not restrict any form of political speech. That's paragraph 3, well, second or third sentence.
That's certainly our view, but the reason we took comment was to evaluate different perspectives.
Good, fair enough. I'm glad to hear that you're open. Are you similarly open about the other claim?
I'm afraid time's expired.
Wow, it's like an Israeli commando.
3 minutes goes quickly.
Pretty quick. Thank you.
And we have other members. Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your patience and letting us return to inquire of you. Can I just make a quick comment first? Thank you so much for a forward-looking budget, one that tries to invest in our people, that tries to build an economy that works for all Americans. There's a particular aspect of your budget that you submitted on behalf of the President that I wanted to touch on because it's an issue that often escapes notice as an economic engine of growth, and that is immigration reform. Many of us know that if we are finally able to fix our broken immigration system, not only is it good for our national security, not only is it good for families that will no longer be torn apart, but it's also extremely good for our workers, for our businesses, and our economy in general. You include within the budget immigration reform, and it scores as giving a net positive to the economy and to American businesses and workers. Can you comment on that?
Congressman, I think that the immigration reform issue is one that there are many reasons to be for. It's the right thing to do, it's good for our economy, and it's who we are as a people. The economic argument is, I think, undeniable. You look at the CBO estimates that were done on the immigration bill that came out of the Senate, it makes clear that it grows the workforce, it grows payroll taxes, it helps to fund Social Security and Medicare. It has a material positive impact on the economy. And you look at our businesses in this country, whether it's the Fortune 500 or the high-tech firms where innovation is greatest, a disproportionate number are founded by either immigrants or first-generation Americans. It has been the American story that we constantly replenish the innovative spirit of this country with people who come here in search of a better life and in building a better America. And I think the economy reflects that, and the numbers reflect that.
And most of what you've just said reflects American values. Maybe now give me a sense in terms of the hard numbers. In terms of the budget, the hard numbers, what's the impact of including immigration reform in your budget?
Congressman, I may have the exact number with me. If not, I'll get back to you. The estimates are that the deficit would be reduced by about $850 billion, over the long term, and the economy would grow by about $1.4 trillion over the next 2 decades. So we're talking about large impacts.
So if you were to take out immigration reform from your budget, we would lose that close to $1 trillion in deficit reduction and over $1 trillion in economic growth.
The effects of immigration reform, if you don't do immigration reform, would be removed. Our budget is a policy budget.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gerlach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for coming today. I want to focus on your initial comments about Ukraine. By way of disclosure, I co-chair the Ukraine caucus here in the House, so I was very interested by your initial comments in your testimony. First of all, let me say thank you to the President and the administration for this action they've taken on this executive order to block the assets and the property of a number of people. If you have the information now, great. If not, if you can provide it to me, do you have any estimates or approximations about how many people this particular executive order would impact in terms of those people that have property or assets within the jurisdiction and the authority of the United States that can be blocked or frozen? Do you have any rough estimates at this point what that is?
Congressman, I don't have that right now. What we did this morning was we laid down a very clear framework. It's flexible. It's something that can be directed in a number of different directions. It's aimed at identifying individuals or entities that are undermining democratic processes in Ukraine, not just Ukrainians, threaten the peace, security, and stability and sovereignty of Ukraine, that contribute to the misappropriation of funds, or that purport to assert authority inappropriately over the Ukraine. So it gives us a tool that is very flexible to work with so that we can respond in a proportional way to the situation as it develops.
Okay. Do you get a sense, based on your discussions within the administration, do you get a sense yet about the European Union partners of ours, whether they're going to be willing to move forward with aggressive sanctions the way is necessary, and I think is going to be continued to be debated and discussed here in Congress and with the administration? Do you get a sense that the European Union countries are going to also be as aggressive as necessary with this situation?
The European Union just the other day, yesterday, took action really following on what we did almost immediately when our financial center put on a watch list individuals who might be moving Ukrainian money inappropriately out of government and public accounts. Yesterday, the European Union did designate a number of Ukrainians. I know the leaders in Europe are meeting today, even while this hearing is going on. We've obviously made the case for solidarity in dealing with this issue in a very united way. And just to reference my own comments this morning, it's one of the reasons we think it's so important that the IMF issue, the IMF reform issue, is relevant. That's one of the things that we need to do to show that we have the leadership role where we can press others to do what they need to do at the IMF and to speak with a real voice of leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. On the question of further changes in the way we tax international transactions, you have a number of new proposals in your budget. You refer in the budget documents to stateless income, to tax havens, to incentives that are in our tax code to export jobs overseas. In terms of measuring the extent of the change that needs to occur in the short term, if I read the documents correctly, you say that over the next 10 years, there are about $276 billion in additional revenues that should be in our Treasury that are not as a result of these loopholes and special provisions.
Congressman, I have to go back and check the numbers to see if that's exactly right, but it's a significant impact, and it reflects really what we think is both an important policy issue and something that there should be bipartisan agreement on, which is that our tax code should not encourage the export of American jobs. We need to close down the provisions that offer preferential treatment for those kinds of practices.
There is one new provision there, and I believe you discussed it with Chairman Camp. He has a provision in his proposal also that would use the transition monies in changing the system overall to fund our serious problems with highway infrastructure. I know the issue of a temporary tax holiday has come up several times in the past, and the administration has opposed that. When I asked President Obama about it when he was here at the Capitol last year, he said, we've looked at the math and it just doesn't work to have a temporary tax holiday as distinguished from perhaps some future transition. Does the administration continue to oppose as unwise any temporary tax holiday or short-term tax holiday of the type we had in 2004 to fund transportation or anything else?
Congressman, we think that the proposal that the President made in July and that's now in our budget is the right way to do it, which is to have a transition to a new reform tax system, which is very different from a one-time tax holiday. We think the scoring would be different. We think the policy is different. We think that's the right way to do it. And I hope we can work together on an approach to business tax reform where we can get this done, and we're very open to that conversation and would love to engage in it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Lew, for time to be be here today. I'd like to associate myself briefly with Mr. Bustani's comments and concerns relating to the various issues. But while countries such as Japan are taking positive steps to open up to more U.S. agriculture, it's vital we have trade promotion opportunities, actually, to ensure we get the strongest assurances our trade partners in Asia and Europe will not continue to use unscientific barriers to discriminate against American producers, and I hope that we can work together to address these issues. Relating to the budget, more specifically, though, I hope that with tax reform we can help more hardworking taxpayers than just corporations filing under the C corporation designation, and also looking at various other things. I know that in your statement you indicated the President's budget adheres to agreed to discretionary spending caps, but also includes an additional $56 billion discretionary spending fund above and beyond that. Can you explain why that occurred?
Yes, Congressman. It was very important that there was a budget agreement in December, very important that Congress passed appropriation bills in January, and that we're on a path. We're including the enactment of borrowing authority. We're doing business in a more orderly way. It's good for the economy. It's good for the country. The President laid out a budget within the boundaries of the budget agreement. He also said that as a matter of policy, just as the December budget agreement had a way of paying for increased discretionary resources with other changes, we need to continue down that path because as we go forward, we don't have the right discretionary levels. We're going to need things to invest in both our economy and our security, but we have to pay for it, and he offered his proposal of how to do that. He was very clear that he has a budget within the caps, and then he has things that he would propose as policy changes where we hope we can get that conversation going. Obviously, if we can't agree on how to pay for it, we're left with lower spending levels.
Well, I would hope that with the $17 trillion debt that we're facing, this is an agreed-upon situation or analysis that we can pursue policies that can help reverse that. And thank you.
The only thing I'd add, Congressman, is that when the Budget Control Act was enacted, it was set up for sequestration not to happen. It was set up to have an overall budget agreement make sequestration unnecessary. And the President's budget really is consistent with that, saying here's another way to back out some of those cuts that we did not ever really think were right, nor on a bipartisan basis did anyone say they wanted at the time.
Well, and I hope that moving forward we can work together on some fantastic opportunities to grow our economy, tax reform, comprehensive tax reform.
Look forward to working together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Liu, we appreciate your taking time to join us and visit us. I appreciate the Chairman in his work dealing with tax reform carved out some space for infrastructure investment. I also appreciate the strong word that we've had from the President supporting infrastructure. It was part of the Recovery Act. It's been referenced going forward, and that there is a proposal that has been included. In the off chance that neither your proposal or the Chairman's proposal are enacted in the next 6 months, we are facing a deadline. We've basically exhausted the trust fund. We have contracts that are not going to be, the Department of Transportation is going to be withholding money this summer. States and localities, as a result, are going to be pulling back this spring. We are facing a 30% reduction over the next 10 years, and we need a stable, long-term, consistent source of funding. Now, I'm not suggesting that the administration dive into another area. You'll fight for your proposal, and we'll see what happens. But I would hope that we would be, that there's a possibility of being open to a proposal that I've introduced that's supported by the AFL-CIO, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the AAA, truckers, contractors, local government, a number of individual unions, professional groups, to raise the gas tax to be able to replenish it. Would the administration, if their proposal is not accepted, if the Chairman's proposal is not enacted, would the administration be open to working with Congress on the first gas tax increase in 21 years? Would you entertain that at least?
Congressman, I also was pleased to see in the chairman's tax reform proposal that he was, as we are, looking for a way to fund infrastructure. We have tried in our budgets a number of different approaches to engage in a serious bipartisan conversation about how to fund something that I think we all agree we need to do, which is maintain our infrastructure for economic growth in the future. We've put in our budget what we think is the best way to deal with it, and we're going to continue to advocate for that. But if you look at the budget proposals we've put in past years, we've said we remain available to work with Congress on a bipartisan basis to find a mutually acceptable funding mechanism, and that remains at the core our belief today.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Chairman, I would hope that sometime in the near future we might be able to have a hearing on transportation finance. Since that's our jurisdiction, the clock is ticking, and I think it would be enlightening to at least hear so we can prepare for our responsibilities later in the spring.
I know we're looking and working with you on maybe trying to do something in that vein in the near future.
Super. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Jenkins is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. This year, President Obama chose to unveil his budget late again at a D.C. elementary school. And in his remarks, he said, "My budget is designed with their generation and future generations in mind. And at a time when our deficits have been cut in half, it allows us to meet our obligations for future generations without leaving them a mountain of debt." That's end of the quote. However, just last month, CBO said the deficit will start to grow again in just 2 years. By 2022, we will again be running trillion-dollar deficits, even though we will be taking in historically large amounts of revenue. And this is just because spending will grow twice as much as revenue. Over the next 10 years, we will add $10 trillion more to our national debt for a grand total of $27 trillion. A quote from CBO said this: "Such large and growing federal debt could have serious negative consequences, including restraining economic growth in the long term," end quote. In the latest forecast, CBO projected that our nation's growth potential over the next 10 years will be much slower than the average since 1950. Contributing to this lost potential, CBO states, the economic and incentives caused by federal tax and spending policies that are expected to keep hours worked and output lower than would be otherwise expected. CBO now expects federal budget deficits between 2014 and 2023 to be about $7.3 trillion, which is $1 trillion larger than predicted last year, due primarily to weak growth. If the president's budget were to become law, even by the president's own number crunchers, our nation's debt would still reach $25 trillion. It would add $8.3 trillion to the debt and hike taxes by over $1 trillion, and fails to ever reach balance. Not too long ago, back in 2008, when candidate Obama criticized his predecessor as unpatriotic and irresponsible for the debt growing from $5 trillion to $9 trillion in his 8 years in office. In his words, and I quote, "He is taking out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children," end quote. Can you help explain to us and square the words of candidate Obama with President Obama?
Congresswoman, as somebody who was director of O&B for the only 3 years in modern times when we ran a surplus, I understand the value of fiscal policy that puts this country in a solid place. When I left O&B in 2001, there was a $5 trillion surplus over the next 10 years being projected. When I came back to O&B, we had a huge deficit because the money had been spent on tax cuts we couldn't afford, on wars we didn't pay for, and then we had the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. President Obama came into office.
Since our time's limit, under this budget, what year will the federal government stop taking or stop spending more money than they take in?
Congresswoman, as I've said,
Do we have a year?
this budget.
Is it true that in this budget, we never, ever can point to a point in time where we will stop spending more money than we take in?
If you look at the period,
I'm just asking, is that true?
If you look at the period covered by this budget,
Is that true or
it puts the deficit into a place where it's sustainable. When we came into office, it was out of control. We have more work to do going forward, but this budget is.
So it never ever balances,
it takes the deficit down to less than 2% of GDP by
All right,
the 10-year window.
Time has expired. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I commend the President for his focus on increasing work and opportunity within the budget, and I want to highlight the expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit and exclusion of payroll income from education credit calculations as critical changes needed. I have advanced similar legislation solutions for years, and I'm pleased to see the administration embrace these changes. For years, I have actively promoted expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit for single workers within my fatherhood bill. I heard from my constituents years ago that the EITC was not helping single men as it could and should, and the research supports their concerns. My fatherhood bill originally focused on expanding the EITC for non-custodial fathers who are current on their child care obligations. In the last few years, we have expanded our focus to include all single workers, including those without children, given the concomitant strong positive effects on lowering the unemployment rates, increasing marriage rates, and reducing incarceration rates for single men. The EITC has been one of the most effective anti-poverty programs in our tax code, which is why there is a long history of bipartisan support. Indeed, the largest expansions were led by conservative Republicans, such as the former Majority Leader Dick Armey. I applaud the President for incentivizing work through an expansion of the EITC and promise to work with the administration to do so. Further, I am extremely happy to see the improvements to how the code handles Pell Grants. I have championed this fix for years because it will make college more affordable for our lowest income students. Mr. Secretary, could you comment on how these policies would improve opportunity and decrease policy?
Congressman, I think I agree 100% that the Earned Income Tax Credit has been one of the most important policies we've had in the last quarter century to deal with both incentives to work and ending poverty. I've had the privilege of working on it since the Ford administration, and it's been expanded in Democratic and Republican administrations by Democratic and Republican Congresses because it works. So we've put a proposal on the table to deal with a population that's not now getting as much benefit from it as they might, and we think it is an important policy, and we look forward to working with the Congress on it. In terms of educational opportunity, we know that the difference between opportunities in life are dramatic for people who have not had a higher education. So whether it's Pell Grants or AOTC, our budget is aimed at giving every American a chance to succeed in this economy.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Schock is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Liu, I'd like to draw your attention to an Internal Revenue Service memorandum that our committee got permission from the taxpayer yesterday to use before the committee. This is the first victim of the IRS's targeting of Tea Party groups dating back to February of 2010. This is the memorandum that was used to transfer this case to Washington, D.C. It was an application by the Albuquerque Tea Party for 501c4 status. On this memorandum, the folks in Cincinnati could have checked box A when transferring this case, which says this application involves an issue in which there is inadequate published precedent or rules necessary. Obviously, that's what they check when there's confusion about precedent. But Cincinnati did not check that box, Mr. Liu. They checked box B and then wrote in the reason, which was, quote, per an email response from Holly Paz on February 26 of 2010, this application should be transferred to D.C. due to the potential for media interest. Sir, this is the first of hundreds of Tea Party cases that were held up not in Cincinnati, but rather based on this memorandum and hundreds of others that we have, were held up by directives from Washington, D.C. specifically. This conflicts, obviously, with the administration's assertion when this news first broke that nobody in Washington, D.C.'s IRS office or the administration knew anything about it, that it was solely isolated to Cincinnati. As you know, Holly Paz is second in command, or was at the IRS for exempt organizations. She has since resigned. The first in command, Lois Lerner, has pled the fifth. And this committee has struggled to get the information from the IRS, particularly the emails of Lois Lerner. And I hope that you can confirm with this committee you're going to do everything in your power to get us 100% of Lois Lerner's emails. Right now we've gotten a couple percent of Lois Lerner's emails, which made it very difficult, quite frankly, to reach some determination. My question, Mr. Liu, is this. The rule that you've put out in November states this rule is necessary because there was some confusion within the IRS about how to handle these Tea Party, these groups' tax-exempt status. But, sir, this email or this memorandum and subsequent emails suggests otherwise. This suggests that throughout 2009 and early 2010, hundreds of these similar-like Tea Party applications were approved, screened, went through the normal process, and it wasn't until Washington, D.C. got involved through a directive via email to Cincinnati that instructed them to uphold or to withhold approval and rather to start batching these applications. So why the inconsistency between D.C. really being the directive versus Cincinnati making this decision on their own?
Mr. Chairman, do I have the time?
If you could make a brief answer.
Congressman, first, I'm reading this piece of paper that's been put in front of me, and just to be clear, what it says is that the application should be transferred to the EO technical, which is what is standard procedure when an office doesn't know what to do and it's complicated. So it doesn't say exactly what you described. Secondly, well, the issue of ambiguity and confusion in the rules, it was not my observation alone. The IG that did a report on this reached that conclusion and said it was necessary to clarify it. So it's not, I don't think it's just a question of my saying that there's ambiguity. There was a finding by the IG, which is one of the things that triggered the review that led to the proposal. And as I've said earlier, we know that this is a complicated area. We invited comment. It was not even a full proposed rule. It was a draft of a proposed rule saying we need comment to make sure we get this right. We got 150,000 comments and we're working our way through them.
Lerner's emails?
Thank you. Time's expired. I would just say, Mr. Secretary, we don't have all the documents, and I've sought your assistance in trying to make sure that we get all the documents in the future. Mr. Thompson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here. I have just one question, given the time constraints, and that's on the provision in the President's budget that repeals the LIFO tax provision, last in, first out. And it's my understanding that it doesn't just end the LIFO opportunities or practices, but it does it somewhat retroactively, where it reaches back and requires a repayment from companies, large and small, of the benefits that they've received from LIFO over the years. Is that correct?
Congressman, the policy is to shift so that we make sure we don't end up with a permanent avoidance of taxation because the accounting system permits the increase in value of inventory to go to not be captured. If you sell something that you made for $1 at $10 and the last one cost you $10 to make and you deduct $10, there's no taxation.
I understand how the LIFO practice works, but my my interest is in the retroactivity of the provision in the President's budget. I don't know how it can be fair where you could go back 60 or 70 years and basically reassess someone and their tax liability. It'd be like your tax bracket going up, and we go back 10 years and require you to pay that under that new provision.
So the policy repeals LIFO, so that has the effect of treating it as an accounting change, which is reversed, and that's how it was designed. I'd be happy to follow up with you on your concerns about the impact of that.
Well, I've talked to you about it in the past because it's not the first time that it showed up, and I would be honored to be able to sit and talk to you and explain how this particular provision would be harmful to many constituents in my district, but in other districts as well. But it just seems grossly unfair to change the taxing provisions and then go back 60 years and collect on that. If that happens, this is going to have the effect of putting people out of business, and that's not. And that's not. Maybe they will have a tough time. Maybe they won't be able to make it. But it's going to have a crippling effect on a pretty important part of our economy.
Yeah, I don't think we agree that the impact would be as you've described it, but I'm happy to follow up.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, I would just say I appreciate the concerns you're raising, and that's why the draft, at least the discussion draft, pairs that with a lower rate for manufacturers on that. Mr. Buchanan.
Yeah, Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here today. I do a lot of town halls, a lot of us do. I got here in 2007. And the budget we're proposing today, I think the biggest issue that comes out of those meetings is debt, deficit, and spending. But the budget we're proposing today, the revenues are going to be what, and the spending is going to be what, for the record? Just quickly, I'm not asking you per dime. I mean, but
no, I understand it, but I don't want to give you a number and have it be wrong.
Anyway, let me just say this because we've got 3 minutes. I think it's about $700,000-800,000 difference. Here's my point I'm trying to make. You had mentioned that we've made some progress. We've cut the deficit in half, $1.3 trillion down to $700 billion or something like that. But the big concern is, and you mentioned about 2% of the GDP, that's all the deficit's going to go up. But I got here in 2007, and I've been hearing it for the last 7 or 8 years. The fact of the matter is, in that year, the debt was $8.5 trillion roughly. We were running a $130 billion deficit. Today, it's $17 trillion, quickly going on. By the time this administration finishes up, it's going to be $20 trillion in debt. If you look at the normal cost of money, this is what I hear every day. Normal cost of money is 4 or 5%. You could have $1 trillion in interest, which is 30% of the whole budget in terms of debt reduction. And so I say this to you because I was born in Detroit. I grew up in the Detroit area. Detroit's bankrupt. And I'm concerned about the future of our country. What I hear from business people in my community and other places is that they're concerned about the uncertainty because of the debt and deficit spending. So I guess I just ask you, what would you tell my constituents when I have to deal with this everywhere? They say nowhere else on the planet do they do what they do in Washington. In the state of Florida, we had less revenues. We made the adjustments. But here, we're leaving a bankrupt country to our children if we don't change the way we do business. And it seems like the administration has to lead on this. Congress has got a responsibility. And I will say it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans if you look over 50 years. But if we don't change this, we're going to use it's going to be devastating to our children and grandchildren. So I would like to have you look at the debt, long-term deficit as well. But what would be your comments to my constituents?
Congressman, you know, as I said earlier, as somebody who was the budget director for 3 years when we ran a surplus, we balanced the budgets, we ran a surplus, I took a lot of pride in having accomplished that. It was policies that were enacted between 2001 and 2008 that dug a hole, we didn't have a surplus anymore, and then we had the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. So now we do have a deficit of $649 billion in 2014, but the numbers as a percentage of GDP really matter. During the same period from 2000...
let me just say, I know what you're saying. You don't think the debt matters? I mean, $17 trillion,
no, but Congressman,
going to $20 trillion, you don't think? That's what, I'm telling you what people are telling me.
So when
they're concerned about the future for Medicare, Social Security, and their children when they see this debt continue to skyrocketing. And I think that's a game that's been played, frankly, in Washington with Republicans and Democrats over the last 50 years. It's that debt that's got everybody concerned.
Yeah, and if you could just answer briefly.
Yeah, we have cut the deficit in half, and we have the deficit in the last year as a percentage of GDP under 2%. GDP will grow from $17 billion to $27 billion over that period. So nominal numbers and percentage of GDP are both important numbers, and the percentage of GDP shows the progress we've made. So I know it's hard to explain because GDP is a complicated concept, but it's a much bigger economy in 10 years.
Come to Sarasota, Florida, and do a town hall with me, and we'll see what we got. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I wanted to go into you made a comment that we're kind of through this emergency type situation. We don't have a crisis looming over our head in some of your testimony. And one of the things I'm very concerned about is the overall entitlement bomb that I see going off with Medicare insolvency, Social Security insolvency. And those are long-term issues. But something that really touched me last night when I was reading the budget and looking through your written testimony is I saw no reference to Social Security disability and the insolvency that's going to hit in January 2016 with the Social Security disability program. In fact, in your testimony, the only reference to Social Security was in relationship to its relationship with immigration reform. So my concern is if the White House doesn't see this impending $35 billion problem in 2016, where Social Security disability recipients are going to receive 20% cut in their payments monthly as a result of this insolvency with the Disability Trust Fund, I care about those people. Those are millions of people that are going to wake up, and the best we're doing right now in Washington, D.C. is say, we're not even putting it in our budget. We're not even going to address it as a crisis, as an impending entitlement bomb going off. To me, it's the canary in the coal mine that if we don't get our act together, and I encourage the White House to please highlight this issue and come up with a solution, because I'm not seeing it in the budget. I don't see it in your testimony. And I don't want to look at a Social Security disability recipient, as I have in town halls, and said, I'm trying to fix it, but I'll tell you, Washington, D.C., not listening.
Congressman, I totally agree that we need to address the situation in the Social Security Disability Trust Fund, and we do I've said that there's only one solution the technical experts believe can work in the time frame between now and 2016, and that's a reallocation of the tax rate as we've done in the past. At the same time, we've proposed in our budget program integrity provisions that will make sure that we do an even better job making sure that only people who are qualified get disability payments. We'll clear out the backlogs of reviews. And we need to work together on that, and we look forward to working together on it. It's something we need to deal with.
I wholeheartedly
because 2016
agree we need
is close.
work together.
And we do have a little more time on the other
The problem with reallocating the tax is, aren't you then hurting the actual the solvency of Social Security itself?
Given the difference,
given
the difference in size between the trust funds, it has a very small impact on the duration of the
So you're
Social
willing to
Security
sacrifice the viability of Social Security itself in order to
I'm just saying
that
that none of the policies you could put in place would have an effect in time for 2016. Long-term policies take a long term to have effect. I think technical experts on both sides agree that if you don't want to cut benefits, which none of us want to do on disability, there's going to need to be a reallocation, and we will look forward to working together.
So the White House position as to the fixes for this is to reallocate the tax?
Well, in the short term, but I said we also have program integrity provisions in place, and we look forward to working together to take a look at the longer-term issues in disability.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Time's expired. The Secretary has been very accommodating by coming back today, and I know he has to leave directly at noon, so we'll have one more question, 3-minute period from Mr. Young, and then we'll conclude.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, in your opening statement, you indicated that last year the President put forward his budget as part of a balanced compromise. And this year's budget instead reflects the President's vision of a best path forward. Are bipartisan compromises not part of a best path forward?
Congressman, as somebody who spent most of my professional life molding bipartisan compromises, bless you, I very much believe that bipartisan compromises are in the best interest of this country, but you usually start with different positions that get worked out. What we did in last year's budget was we kind of cut to the chase to say we almost had an agreement, let's finish it. Frankly, there wasn't a lot of take-up on our proposal. It was out there, and we didn't get it done. At some point, you have to go back and say, we have our view, you have your view, and then we work for a bipartisan compromise.
So your view, your best path forward, as indicative in this budget, presumably includes never bringing our nation's accounts into balance.
Well, Congressman, I think, as I've said before, we do an enormous amount in this budget to put our fiscal house in order and keep it in order. I think that the challenge we had in 2009 was gargantuan. We've cut the deficit in half. We're on a path towards a 2% of GDP.
We're looking at a path forward here in the budget, not 2001 to 2008. Interesting segment of time you choose, but forward would indicate that it never comes into balance. This doesn't appear to me to be a budget as popularly understood by, say, the business community or rank-and-file Americans. Instead, it's for those of us who celebrate Christmas, a Christmas list. If you could indicate what year it comes into balance and how you intend to bring it into balance, it would be easier to negotiate between our figures, balancing in 10 years in the past, and your figures balancing currently at infinity. Then bipartisan compromise, as I see it, could happen. What say you, sir?
So, Congressman, we came very close to a bipartisan agreement along the lines of last year's budget. That didn't happen, but that didn't come to balance in 10 years. It was not a negotiation about coming to balance in 10 years. We believe that the urgent need right now is to make sure the engine of growth in this country is kicked into high gear. And we've put together a budget that has a responsible fiscal policy and a growth strategy, and we look forward to working in a bipartisan way to reach
If this is your optimal path forward, the country deserves better. History will remember you as the Treasury Secretary who presided over a period when plans were not put forward as our nation started to drown in a sea of red ink. And I would not want to have that sort of legacy. It's regrettable that you won't work with us to make the largest programs of government sustainable. Thank you so much for coming here today and offering your perspective on why you haven't done that.
Congressman, I would just point out that as the only living OMB director in history to have a surplus for 3 years, I'm proud of my record.
Thank you, sir. Right. Thank you for your service. I yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, all members may submit questions for the record. Again, I want to thank the Secretary for his time this morning and for accommodating a very disjointed schedule. With that, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.